If Noah's flood covered the entire earth with water miles deep, where did all that water disappear to? We're not talking about simple evaporation or absorption. Some estimate Noah's flood amounts to enough water to possibly cover the entire height of Mount Everest. What we're looking at here is the complete transformation of the planet's surface that most people have never heard about, and it's far more dramatic than you might imagine. What you're about to discover will completely change how you understand both the flood account and the very geography of the world we live in today. But before we dive in, if you're new to this channel, make sure to hit that like and subscribe button if you haven't already. Your support means we can continue producing these highly researched videos to help you learn something new or pass the time. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is. We'd love to hear from you. So without further ado, let's begin, shall we? The source of the storm, deconstructing the biblical description. Genesis chapter 7 opens with a command. Enter the ark, for in 7 days the rains will come. When those 7 days pass, something breaks open in the heavens and beneath the earth. The text describes windows opening in the sky. It speaks of fountains erupting from the deep places below. For 40 days and 40 nights, water pours down. The floods prevail upon the earth for 150 days. Every high mountain under heaven becomes covered. The waters rise 15 cubits above the peaks. That measurement, roughly 23 feet, ensures even the tallest summits disappear beneath the surface. The account emphasizes totality. All flesh perishes. Everything on dry land with the breath of life in its nostrils ceases to exist. Only Noah remains and those with him in the ark. The mathematics of this event stretch beyond ordinary comprehension. Earth's land surface covers about 57 million square miles. Mount Everest reaches 29,032 feet above sea level today. Adding those 15 cubits brings the required water depth to approximately 29,055 feet across the entire planet. The volume becomes staggering. Current estimates place Earth's total water at roughly 332 million cubic miles. The ocean basins hold about 321 million cubic miles of that total. To cover Earth's surface to the depth described would require more than doubling or tripling the existing water. Some calculations suggest the flood would need approximately 800 million cubic miles of water. That volume exceeds what exists on our planet by a factor of 2.5. Where does this water originate? The text provides two sources, above and below. The windows of heaven suggest atmospheric origins. The fountains of the deep imply subterranean reservoirs. Both sources must contribute enormously to achieve the described inundation. The duration compounds the problem. Waters prevail for 5 months. The ark comes to rest on the mountains of Ararat in the 7th month. By the 10th month, other mountaintops become visible. The dove finds no resting place, then returns with an olive leaf, and finally does not return at all. Noah exits the ark in the 2nd month of the following year. The entire sequence spans just over a year. This timeline creates additional challenges. The water must arrive rapidly enough to flood the world in 40 days. It must remain at peak levels for 5 months. Then it must recede quickly enough that mountain peaks emerge within 3 more months. The mechanisms that could accomplish this remain unclear from the text itself. The narrative focuses on the event and its meaning rather than hydraulic specifics. Ancient readers would have understood this account differently than modern audiences. They lived in a world where the sky appeared as a solid dome with water above it and water below the earth. Rain came through openings in this firmament. Springs and rivers flowed from vast underground oceans. The Genesis cosmology reflects this understanding. The flood represents a reversal of creation. God separated the waters above from the waters below on the 2nd day. Now those separations collapse. Chaos returns to overwhelm the ordered world. The theological purpose emerges clearly. Humanity has become corrupt. Violence fills the earth. God regrets making human beings. The flood serves as both judgment and cleansing. It removes wickedness while preserving a righteous remnant. The covenant with Noah afterward promises no such destruction will come again. The rainbow stands as a sign of this promise. Modern readers face a different challenge. We measure water in cubic miles. We know the atmosphere holds only about 3,100 cubic miles of water as vapor. We understand that ocean basins have formed over hundreds of millions of years through plate tectonics. We recognize that adding enough water to cover Everest would require manufacturing it from nothing, then making it vanish completely afterward. The question becomes unavoidable. If such a flood occurred as described, where did the water come from? More importantly, where did it go? The narrative itself offers no specific answer to the second question. After the waters recede, they simply cease to be a focus. God remembers Noah. A wind passes over the earth, the fountains of the deep and the windows of heaven close. The rain stops, the waters decrease continually, the ark rests, the peaks appear, life begins again. This absence of explanation has troubled readers for millennia. The water's origin and destination form one of the most persistent puzzles in biblical interpretation. Ancient commentators proposed miracles. Modern believers have sought natural mechanisms. Scientists have examined whether such an event remains physically possible. Each approach yields different insights and different problems. The sheer scale demands attention before exploring any solutions. We face a global ocean more than 5 miles deep, covering every landmass simultaneously. We confront the need for that ocean to appear in weeks and disappear in months. We must account for the survival of freshwater fish, saltwater fish, plants, and countless species that could not have fit on a vessel of the Ark's dimensions. We need to explain how 8 people fed and cared for thousands of animals for over a year. We must address why no ice core, tree ring, or sediment record shows evidence of such a catastrophe 4,000 years ago. These challenges have not stopped people from trying to solve them. The remainder of this exploration will examine the attempts, both ancient and modern, to answer the central question: where did the waters go? More fundamentally, could such waters have existed at all? The journey toward answers will take us through theology, pseudoscience, legitimate earth science, archaeology, mythology, and ultimately back to meaning itself. The biblical text makes an enormous claim. Now we must investigate whether that claim describes history, allegory, or something between the two. Ancient answers: miracles, mythology, and the vanishing act. The earliest interpreters of the flood narrative had no need for natural explanations. Divine power created the waters and divine power removed them. This understanding pervaded Jewish and Christian thought for nearly 2 millennia. The miracle itself constituted the answer. Flavius Josephus, writing in the 1st century, provided an account in his Antiquities of the Jews. He described the rains and the rising waters much as Genesis does. When discussing the flood's end, Josephus credited God with calming the waters and making them subside. The mechanism mattered less than the agent. God acted, therefore the result followed. This approach characterized most ancient commentary. The Babylonian Talmud, compiled between the 3rd and 5th centuries, offered more elaborate discussions. Rabbinical tradition held that the flood waters came from multiple sources. Some descended from above, some rose from below. Certain passages suggested these waters were boiling, adding to their destructive power. When the flood ended, some traditions held that the waters returned to their original places. The upper waters went back above the firmament. The lower waters retreated into the deep. Others proposed that God created special caverns and chambers to receive the floodwaters, hiding them away in secret places within the earth. One Talmudic passage suggested that the floodwaters were eventually transformed or absorbed into the oceans. Another tradition held that God made the waters decrease through evaporation and absorption into the ground. These explanations assumed divine intervention at every step. The waters did not obey natural laws in arriving, prevailing, or departing. They followed God's will alone. Early Christian interpreters largely adopted similar views. Augustine of Hippo, writing in the 4th and 5th centuries, treated the flood as literal history. In The City of God, he addressed skeptics who questioned whether the flood could have covered the mountains or whether the ark could have held all species. Augustine argued that God's power made both possible. The same divine will that created the universe could certainly manage the logistics of a global flood. Augustine did not concern himself deeply with where the waters originated or where they went. God commanded them into existence for a purpose. When that purpose concluded, God commanded them away. The specifics belong to divine prerogative rather than natural philosophy. This theological approach satisfied most readers for centuries. Some medieval Jewish scholars proposed that the windows of heaven referred to specific astronomical or meteorological phenomena. Um, Rashi, the 11th century commentator, suggested the phrase meant that God loosened the fixed order that normally limited rainfall. Instead of rain falling according to regular patterns, the heavens opened completely. The boundary between the waters above and below dissolved temporarily. When God restored that boundary, the excess water returned to its proper realm above the visible sky. Nachmanides, writing in the 13th century, offered additional thoughts. He noted that the Torah described the windows closing and the fountains stopping. This implied the sources remained but ceased their activity. The waters did not disappear entirely. They went back to wherever they had been before the flood. The Earth's pre-flood geography must have included enough capacity to contain these waters. Perhaps valleys were deeper. Perhaps ocean basins were larger. The flood represented a temporary redistribution rather than a creation of new water. These medieval interpretations began showing slight movement toward natural explanations. The authors still assumed divine control, but tried to imagine mechanisms that involved existing features of the earth. The waters came from real places and returned to real places, even if God determined the timing and extent. Islamic tradition, drawing from both biblical and Quranic sources, similarly emphasized divine power. The Quran describes the flood in Surah Hud. It mentions water gushing from an oven or a fountain as a sign for Noah to begin boarding. The flood comes from sky and earth together. When the destruction finishes, God commands the earth to swallow its water and the sky to withhold its rain. The waters subside, the ark comes to rest. The matter concludes by divine decree. Medieval Christian scholars in Europe generally followed Augustine's lead. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century acknowledged the flood's miraculous nature. He argued that natural processes could not account for the volume or behavior of the waters. Therefore, the flood stood as evidence of God's direct intervention in history. The waters appeared supernaturally and departed supernaturally. This consensus held for centuries. The flood was history. It was global. It was miraculous. The waters came from God and returned to God's control. Questioning these points meant questioning Scripture itself, a dangerous position in most religious communities. The rise of modern science began changing these discussions. The 17th century saw the birth of geology. Scholars began examining rock layers and fossils. Some, like Thomas Burnet in his Sacred Theory of the Earth, published in the 1680s, attempted to reconcile Genesis with emerging geological knowledge. Burnet proposed that the pre-flood Earth had a smooth surface without mountains or ocean basins. The crust covered a vast abyss of water. During the flood, this crust cracked and collapsed, releasing the waters from below. The broken crust formed mountains and ocean basins. The waters settled into these new depressions. Burnet's theory represented an early attempt to provide a natural mechanism while maintaining biblical accuracy. It failed scientifically but showed the direction thinking would take. As geology advanced, the need for non-miraculous explanations grew more pressing. By the 19th century, most Christian scientists had accepted an old Earth and rejected a global flood. The geological evidence simply did not support it. Yet literalist interpretations persisted, especially in more conservative religious communities. The 20th century would see renewed efforts to vindicate the flood account using scientific language. These efforts would produce elaborate theories about vapor canopies, catastrophic plate tectonics, and hydroplate mechanics. Each attempted to solve the water problem without resorting to pure miracle. Before examining those modern theories, we must recognize what the ancient approach reveals. For most of human history, the flood narrative required no natural explanation. The miracle was the point. God judged the earth, destroyed the wicked, saved the righteous, and restored creation. The waters served as the instrument of divine will. Their origin and destination mattered far less than their purpose and meaning. This perspective remains important. It shows that the water problem only becomes a problem when one attempts to treat the flood as a natural historical event subject to physical laws. The ancient interpreters felt no such constraint. They read the story as theology, not hydrology. The questions we ask today would have seemed strange or irrelevant to them. They knew where the waters went. God took them away. That answer sufficed completely. The canopy theory, a failed modern miracle. The vapor canopy theory emerged in the 20th century as young Earth creationists sought scientific mechanisms for the Genesis flood. The idea seemed elegant. Before the flood, a vast shell of water vapor surrounded the Earth high above the atmosphere. This canopy contained enough water to produce 40 days of rain. When God triggered the flood, this vapor condensed and fell. After the deluge, the canopy no longer existed. The waters now filled the expanded oceans. Henry Morris popularized this concept in The Genesis Flood, published in 1961 alongside John Whitcomb. Morris based his theory on Genesis 1:6-7, which describes waters above the firmament separated from waters below. He interpreted this as a vapor canopy suspended in the upper atmosphere or even beyond it. The canopy served multiple purposes beyond providing floodwater. It created a greenhouse effect, making the entire planet temperate. It filtered harmful radiation, allowing people to live for centuries, as the Genesis genealogies describe. It increased atmospheric pressure, which supposedly enabled larger animals and plants. The theory spread widely through creationist literature. It appeared in textbooks, lectures, and museums. Many believers found it satisfying. It explained where the floodwater came from and where it went. It connected to other aspects of Genesis, like the long lifespans of pre-flood patriarchs. It suggested that Earth's current climate represented a fallen, diminished state compared to the perfect pre-flood world. Joseph Dillow expanded the theory in his 1981 book, The Waters Above. He proposed a canopy containing water equivalent to 40 feet of rain spread globally. He calculated that such a canopy would increase surface temperature by about 10 to 15 degrees Celsius. This would eliminate ice caps and create a global tropical paradise. Dillow also suggested the canopy would have been mostly invisible, allowing starlight through while trapping infrared radiation from Earth's surface. The theory faced immediate problems from atmospheric physics. Water vapor in the quantity required would not remain suspended. It would condense and fall as rain continuously. Even in a vapor state, the sheer mass would create crushing surface pressure. Calculations showed that a canopy holding enough water to raise sea levels by 40 feet would produce surface pressures exceeding 900 pounds per square inch, far beyond what any organism could survive. The thermodynamic problems proved equally devastating. When water vapor condenses, it releases latent heat. The energy released by condensing enough vapor to flood the Earth would raise the planet's temperature by thousands of degrees. The flood would have boiled the oceans and sterilized the planet. Noah and the animals would have cooked inside the ark. This heat problem has no solution within the canopy model. Radiation presented another fatal flaw. Proponents claimed the canopy filtered ultraviolet light, but water vapor does not significantly block UV radiation. It does, however, strongly absorb infrared radiation. A massive canopy would trap heat so effectively that Earth's surface would become uninhabitable. The greenhouse effect would spiral out of control. Instead of a paradise, the pre-flood world would resemble Venus. Atmospheric stability offered yet another challenge. The canopy would need to remain separate from the lower atmosphere for at least 1,600 years from creation to the flood. Nothing in atmospheric physics allows for such stability. Temperature gradients, convection, and basic fluid dynamics all work against a suspended vapor layer. The canopy would mix with lower air masses within days or weeks at most. The amount of water posed its own problem. Calculations showed that to produce the flood described in Genesis, the canopy would need to contain about 40 feet of precipitable water globally. This represents roughly 13 times the water vapor in Earth's current atmosphere. The canopy's mass would be tremendous. Its weight alone would collapse it, even before considering condensation triggers. Visibility created additional issues. A canopy thick enough to hold sufficient water would not be transparent. It would block sunlight, preventing photosynthesis. Plants could not grow. The pre-flood world would exist in permanent twilight or darkness. Proponents tried to solve this by proposing a thin, high-altitude canopy, but that only intensified the heat and pressure problems. By the 1990s, many creationists began abandoning the vapor canopy theory. The physics simply did not work. Even within young Earth creationist organizations like Answers in Genesis, the canopy theory fell out of favor. Their website now lists it among discarded or problematic arguments that should not be used. Some attempted to salvage the concept by proposing a water ice canopy instead of vapor. Ice particles in orbit or suspended magnetically might avoid some of the vapor problems. These proposals introduce new difficulties. How would ice particles remain suspended? What would trigger their simultaneous fall? How would they survive the heat of atmospheric entry? The ice canopy variants solved some problems while creating others equally severe. The canopy theory's failure illustrates a broader pattern in creation science. It began with a desired conclusion that a global flood occurred as described in Genesis. It worked backward to find a mechanism. When that mechanism failed, proponents adjusted the details rather than questioning the conclusion. The theory persisted for decades despite obvious physical impossibilities because it served an ideological purpose. Later research showed that Genesis 1, 6-7 likely described something completely different from a vapor canopy. Ancient Near Eastern cosmology conceived of the sky as a solid dome, the firmament. Waters existed above this dome in the heavenly realm. The text describes separating the waters, not suspending vapor. The passage reflects ancient understanding of the cosmos rather than describing an actual atmospheric structure. The canopy theory also reveals the challenge of literal interpretation. Taking Genesis as a scientific description of Earth's early atmosphere led to elaborate constructions that violated known physics. The same passage read as ancient cosmology requires no such gymnastics. It simply describes how ancient people understood the structure of the universe. Despite its scientific failure, the canopy theory succeeded socially. It provided believers with a seemingly plausible answer to skeptics. It allowed them to maintain confidence in biblical literalism while feeling they had scientific support. The theory spread through Christian schools, homeschool curricula, and popular media. Many people still believe it today, unaware that even most creationists have moved on. The search for the floodwaters would continue. If the canopy could not provide them, perhaps the earth itself could. The next major attempt would look downward rather than upward, proposing catastrophic changes to the planet's crust and mantle. These theories would prove equally problematic, but they would take longer to die. The crustal cataclysm, shifting the Earth to make room. When the vapor canopy theory collapsed under its own physical impossibilities, flood theorists turned to geology. The waters might not have come from above. Perhaps they came from below and remained below. The Earth itself might have changed during the flood, creating space for the waters. This thinking produced catastrophic plate tectonics, or CPT, the most sophisticated creationist flood model. John Baumgartner, a geophysicist who worked at Los Alamos National Laboratory, developed CPT in the 1990s. His approach differed from earlier creationist geology. He used computer modeling and engaged with mainstream geological concepts. He accepted that plate tectonics was real, but argued it happened catastrophically during Noah's flood rather than gradually over millions of years. The CPT model proposes that before the flood, the ocean basins were shallower and the continents stood lower. A single supercontinent existed, much like the Pangaea that geologists recognize, but CPT places it just before the flood rather than 200 million years ago. When the flood began, the dense oceanic crust suddenly started sinking into the mantle at subduction zones. This runaway subduction pulled the ocean floor down rapidly, lowering the seafloor by thousands of feet. Simultaneously, the rapid subduction generated enormous heat. This heat caused the mantle to convect violently. Magma rose at spreading centers, creating new ocean floor. The rapid plate motion over perhaps a year generated earthquakes and volcanic eruptions on an unimaginable scale. These were the fountains of the great deep. They churned the waters and broke apart the land. As the ocean basins deepened through this process, water from the pre-flood ocean rushed into the new deeps. This water briefly covered the continents, producing the flood. Simultaneously, the rapid subduction pushed up mountain ranges. The Himalayas, Andes, and Rockies all formed during the flood year. As these mountains rose and the ocean basins deepened, the waters drained off the continents into the new, deep oceans. By the end of the flood year, the mountains stood tall and the ocean basins were thousands of feet deeper than before. The same amount of water existed, but it now fit into the reconfigured Earth. The model attempts to solve multiple problems at once. It explains where the floodwater came from, the pre-flood ocean. It explains where the water went into the deepened ocean basins. It accounts for the fountains of the Great Deep as volcanic and tectonic activity. It explains mountain formation. It attempts to compress the entire geological column into a single year. Sediments deposited by the flood supposedly created all the fossil-bearing rock layers. CPT represents the most scientifically sophisticated creationist model. Baumgartner published papers in peer-reviewed journals on mantle convection, though not specifically on CPT's flood applications. The model uses real physics and addresses genuine geological observations, yet it fails comprehensively when examined in detail. The heat problem proves fatal. Subducting an entire ocean floor in 1 year releases stupendous amounts of energy. Calculations by geophysicist Joe Meert show that the heat released would vaporize the oceans and melt the Earth's crust. The planet would become a molten sphere. No life could survive. Baumgartner acknowledged this problem, but proposed that God miraculously removed the heat during the flood year. This appeal to miracle defeats the purpose of developing a natural mechanism. The magnetic field evidence contradicts CPT completely. When new oceanic crust forms at spreading centers, it records the Earth's magnetic field direction. The oceanic crust shows hundreds of magnetic reversals and stripes parallel to spreading centers. These stripes match between opposite sides of spreading centers, confirming the gradual nature of seafloor spreading. The Atlantic Ocean basin shows approximately 170 magnetic reversals from its center to its edges. CPT requires all of these to form in about 6 months. The Earth's magnetic field would need to reverse every day or so. No known mechanism can cause such rapid reversals. The field is generated by the motion of liquid iron in the outer core, a process with inherent timescales of thousands of years. Sediment layers present another insurmountable obstacle. The geological column contains vast limestone deposits, coal seams, evaporites like salt and gypsum, and thinly layered formations like the Green River Formation. The Green River Formation in Wyoming contains millions of varves, annual layers deposited in a lake environment. Each varve represents a year of deposition. Counting the varves yields ages of several million years. CPT must compress this into the flood year. A varve supposedly forming every few seconds makes no physical sense. The varves show seasonal variations in fossil content and mineral composition. These variations require time. Limestone formations like the White Cliffs of Dover consist of countless microscopic shells of marine organisms called coccolithophores. These organisms grow, die, and settle slowly to the seafloor. The chalk beds are hundreds of feet thick. Forming them in a year requires sedimentation rates millions of times faster than observed in any modern environment. The shells would be crushed, mixed with mud and sand, and jumbled beyond recognition. Instead, they show peaceful, gradual accumulation. Coal deposits require even more time. Coal forms from buried plant material that accumulates in swamps over thousands of years. The pressure and chemical changes that transform peat into coal require burial depth and time. Some coal seams underlie other sedimentary layers. Then more coal seams appear higher in the sequence. CPT requires forests to grow, accumulate, be buried, turn to coal, then have new forests grow on top, all within months. The process becomes absurd. Erosion patterns on the continents contradict a global flood. Grand Canyon exposes rock layers that were eroded into valleys, then buried by later deposits, then eroded again, then buried again. These unconformities represent millions of years. The Great Unconformity in the Grand Canyon shows a gap of over 1 billion years between the rock below and above. The lower rock was metamorphosed, uplifted, and eroded flat before the upper layers deposited on top. CPT must compress this into a single flood event. The mechanisms do not exist. The fossil record shows clear patterns incompatible with a single flood. Marine fossils appear in marine sediments. Terrestrial fossils appear in terrestrial sediments. The organisms are sorted by complexity and ecological zone. No flowering plants appear in Cambrian rocks. No mammals appear in Devonian rocks. No modern birds appear alongside dinosaurs. CPT proposes that organisms were sorted by their ability to escape rising waters, with slow marine creatures buried first and faster mammals buried last. This cannot explain the consistent absence of certain groups in older rocks. Were there no slow mammals or fast fish? The geographic distribution of fossils also contradicts CPT. Marsupial fossils concentrate in Australia and South America. Lemur fossils appear almost exclusively in Madagascar. If all animals lived together before the flood and were sorted by a single catastrophe, this distribution makes no sense. CPT theorists argue that animals lived in ecological zones that happen to coincide with modern continents. This requires improbable coincidences on a global scale. Ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica show annual layers going back hundreds of thousands of years. These layers contain trapped air bubbles, volcanic ash from known eruptions, and isotopic variations that track climate. The ice shows no evidence of a global flood 4,500 years ago. The layers continue uninterrupted. CPT must argue that these ice sheets formed after the flood. This requires ice accumulation rates thousands of times faster than observed today. The physics of ice sheet formation, depending on snowfall rates and compaction, makes this impossible. Tree ring chronologies extend back over 12,000 years using overlapping sequences from living and dead trees. The oldest living trees predate the supposed flood date. Bristlecone pines in California have been aged to over 4,800 years. These trees show no sign of drowning or burial. Their rings record annual climate variations that match regional patterns. CPT must either argue that the flood missed these trees specifically or that tree ring dating is fundamentally flawed. Neither argument withstands scrutiny. Human civilization presents its own challenge. Egyptian dynastic history extends back before the flood date proposed by young Earth chronologies. The pyramids were built around 2600 to 2500 BCE. This falls before or during the flood according to a 2030-48 BCE date. Egyptian records show no awareness of a civilization-ending catastrophe at this time. Continuous occupation sites exist in the Middle East going back 10,000 years or more. These sites show gradual cultural development, not sudden repopulation after a flood. CPT's attempt to preserve biblical literalism while engaging real science results in a model that violates physics, contradicts observations, and requires miracles at key points. Baumgartner himself admits that removing the heat requires divine intervention. At that point, the model ceases to be natural history and becomes theology with equations attached. The theory remains popular in creationist circles because it represents their best effort. It uses sophisticated language and computer models. It engages with real geological data. Most believers lack the background to evaluate its claims critically. They see mathematical equations and assume scientific validity. The theory succeeds socially while failing scientifically. The search for the floodwaters leads to an inescapable conclusion. The waters never existed. The mechanisms proposed to generate and remove them violate known physics. The geological evidence points elsewhere. Before examining that evidence directly, we must establish the baseline. Where is Earth's water actually located? The hydrologic home, where Earth's water truly lives. Earth contains approximately 332 million cubic miles of water. This volume has remained essentially constant for billions of years. Water cycles between reservoirs, changes state from liquid to vapor to ice, but the total amount does not increase or decrease significantly. Understanding where this water resides reveals the impossibility of a global flood. The oceans hold the overwhelming majority. About 301 million cubic miles, or 96.5% of all water, fills the ocean basins. The Pacific Ocean alone contains roughly half of Earth's water. These basins formed over hundreds of millions of years as tectonic plates moved and continental crust separated. The water accumulated gradually as volcanic outgassing and comet impacts delivered hydrogen and oxygen to the early Earth. Ocean depth averages about 12,080 feet. The deepest point, the Mariana Trench, descends to approximately 36,000 feet. These depths result from the density difference between oceanic crust and continental crust. Oceanic crust, made of denser basaltic rock, sinks lower in the mantle than continental crust. This creates natural basins. The water fills these basins to the brim. Sea level represents equilibrium between the volume of water and the volume of the basin. Ice caps and glaciers hold the second largest reservoir. About 5.8 million cubic miles of ice, roughly 1.74% of all water, exists primarily in Antarctica and Greenland. Antarctica's ice sheet alone contains about 5.4 million cubic miles. If all this ice melted, sea levels would rise approximately 230 feet. This would flood many coastal cities, but would not come close to covering the continents, let alone the mountains. Groundwater constitutes the third major reservoir. Approximately 5.6 million cubic miles of water, about 1.69% of the total, saturates pores and fractures in rock and sediment beneath the surface. This water extends to depths of several miles where heat and pressure close off pore spaces. Aquifers provide drinking water for billions of people. The water moves slowly through the subsurface, sometimes taking thousands of years to travel from recharge areas to discharge points. Lakes contain only 21,000 cubic miles of water. Rivers hold merely 509 cubic miles. Swamps and marshes account for 2,752 cubic miles. These surface freshwater sources total about 0.007% of Earth's water. They receive their water from precipitation and groundwater flow. They provide ecosystems and human water supplies far out of proportion to their volume. The atmosphere holds approximately 3,100 cubic miles of water as vapor. This represents merely 0.001% of total water. At any given moment, this vapor could condense into about 1 inch of rain spread globally. The atmosphere cycles this water rapidly. An individual water molecule spends an average of 9 days in the atmosphere before precipitating out. The global water cycle moves about 120,000 cubic miles annually from ocean to atmosphere through evaporation, then back to ocean and land through precipitation. Soil moisture accounts for about 3,959 cubic miles. This water sits in the root zone, available to plants. It represents the interface between the surface and groundwater systems. Biological water, the water contained in all living organisms, amounts to less than 269 cubic miles. Permafrost holds about 71,970 cubic miles as frozen ground. These numbers reveal a critical truth. Earth's water fills the existing basins and reservoirs completely. No hidden reserve exists. There is no secret chamber containing twice the current ocean volume. The water we have is the water that exists. To flood the Earth to cover Mount Everest requires adding approximately 800 million cubic miles of water. This would nearly triple the total amount. The water would need to materialize from nowhere. After the flood, it would need to vanish entirely or squeeze into basins that currently hold less than half that volume. Neither option obeys physical laws. Some flood theorists have proposed that pre-flood ocean basins were shallower. If the average ocean depth were 6,000 feet instead of 12,000 feet, the same volume of water would cover less area. The continents would stand lower and less water would be needed for a flood. This proposal fails for multiple reasons. Ocean basin depth results from tectonic processes operating over hundreds of millions of years. Rapidly deepening the basins during the flood was catastrophic plate tectonics, which we have already seen cannot work. Even if basins could deepen, the water remains a problem. A flood covering continents at lower elevations still requires far more water than exists. Others have suggested that pre-flood mountains were lower. Perhaps Mount Everest rose rapidly during the flood year. This does not solve the problem. Lower mountains still require global inundation. Everest's height of 29,000 feet might reduce to 10,000 feet or less, but covering even 10,000-foot peaks globally still demands several times Earth's current water volume. The mechanisms that lift mountains operate over millions of years as continents collide and buckle. Rapid uplift during the flood faces the same catastrophic plate tectonics problems already discussed. The hydroplate theory, proposed by Walter Brown, suggests that a vast subterranean ocean existed beneath the crust before the flood. When this chamber ruptured, water shot into the atmosphere and flooded the Earth. After the flood, this water now fills the current oceans. This theory fails immediately upon examining subsonic seismic data. We can map the structure beneath the crust in extraordinary detail. No evidence exists for the vast caverns or chambers this theory requires. The subsurface contains rock and magma, not liquid water oceans. Small amounts of water exist bound in mineral structures deep in the mantle, but this water is chemically bonded and cannot flow freely. The distribution of Earth's water shows that it occupies every available space. Ocean basins are full, aquifers are charged, lakes exist where topography allows. The atmosphere holds as much vapor as temperature and pressure permit. Ice caps exist where temperatures remain below freezing. No room remains for hiding massive quantities of water. No mechanism exists for rapidly moving water between these reservoirs on a scale sufficient to cause a global flood. Modern satellite measurements track changes in water distribution with millimeter precision. The GRACE satellites measured gravitational variations caused by mass changes, primarily water moving between land and ocean. Data shows seasonal variations as snow accumulates and melts, as aquifers recharge and deplete. Long-term trends show ice loss from Greenland and Antarctica contributing to sea level rise of about 3 millimeters per year. These measurements confirm that Earth's water budget behaves predictably according to known physical processes. No evidence suggests catastrophic redistributions occurred recently. The stability of the water cycle over geological time shows in the rock record. Sedimentary rocks preserve evidence of ancient environments. Limestone formed in warm, shallow seas. Sandstone shows ancient deserts and rivers. Shale represents muddy ocean floors or lake beds. These rocks span hundreds of millions of years. They show that water cycled between ocean and atmosphere, depositing sediments in familiar patterns. No layer suggests a global flood fundamentally disrupted this pattern. Understanding where Earth's water actually resides leads to an unavoidable conclusion. The water required for a global flood does not exist. It has never existed. The mechanisms proposed to create or hide this water violate physics and contradict observations. The search for the flood waters ends here. They were never real. The question now becomes whether the rocks themselves preserve evidence of such a flood. Spoiler, they do not. A world underwater? What the rocks really say. Sedimentary rocks cover about 3/4 of Earth's continents. These rocks form from particles deposited by water, wind, or ice, then compressed and cemented over time. If a global flood occurred 4,500 years ago, these rocks should record the event clearly. They should show a single layer of chaotic, mixed sediment containing fossils from all environments jumbled together. Instead, they show the opposite. The Grand Canyon exposes nearly 2 billion years of Earth's history in vertical succession. Walking from the rim to the river means traveling backward through time. The youngest layers sit on top. The oldest rest at the bottom. Each layer tells a story about the environment when it formed. The Kaibab limestone caps the canyon rim. This layer formed in a shallow, warm sea about 270 million years ago. Fossils include marine creatures like brachiopods, corals, and crinoids. Below lies the Toroep Formation, then the Coconino Sandstone. The Coconino shows features unmistakable in their origin. Cross-bedding patterns indicate wind-blown sand dunes. Fossil trackways preserve the footprints of small reptiles walking across ancient dunes. These prints show individual toe marks, tail drags, and stride patterns. Water-deposited sediment would obliterate such delicate features. Beneath the Coconino sits the Hermit Shale, formed in a coastal plain environment with muddy tidal flats. Below that rests the Supai Group, representing a transitional environment between marine and terrestrial. The Redwall limestone forms massive cliffs of pure marine limestone, packed with sea creature fossils. Descending further reveals the Muav limestone, bright Angel Shale, and Tapiat sandstone, all marine deposits from progressively older seas. At the bottom of the canyon, the Vishnu schist represents metamorphosed rock nearly 2 billion years old. This rock was once sediment or volcanic material that got buried, heated, pressurized, and transformed. The process requires tens of miles of burial and millions of years. Between the Vishnu schist and the Tapiat sandstone above lies the Great Unconformity, a gap representing over 1 billion years of missing time. The lower rocks were metamorphosed, uplifted, eroded flat, then new sediments deposited on top. This sequence requires multiple cycles of burial and erosion, impossible in a single flood year. Each layer in the Grand Canyon maintains consistent thickness across hundreds of miles. The boundaries between layers are sharp and distinct. Many layers show ripple marks, mud cracks, raindrop impressions, and burrows. These features form at the sediment surface and require time between successive deposits. A global flood would create chaotic mixing, not orderly layering. The fossil record shows clear patterns. Simple marine organisms appear in the oldest rocks. Fish appear later. Amphibians appear after fish. Reptiles appear after amphibians. Mammals appear last among the vertebrates. Flowering plants appear only in more recent rocks. No exceptions exist. No trilobites occur alongside dinosaurs. No rabbits appear in Cambrian rocks. This pattern extends globally. The same sequence appears on every continent. Flood geologists argue that organisms were sorted by their ability to escape rising waters or by their ecological zones. Marine creatures living on the ocean floor would be buried first. Land animals fleeing to higher ground would be buried last. This fails to explain the consistent absence of certain groups. Were there no slow mammals or fast marine creatures? Did no birds fly to safety alongside pterosaurs? Why do modern birds never appear with dinosaurs despite similar flying abilities? Ecological zonation cannot explain the pattern either. The theory suggests that different organisms lived in different zones, with marine creatures in lowlands and mammals in highlands. The flood buried these zones in order from low to high. This predicts we should find all marine organisms in lower rocks and all terrestrial organisms in upper rocks. Instead, we find marine organisms throughout the column, interspersed with terrestrial deposits. Marine limestone appears above and below dinosaur-bearing rock layers. The ocean transgressed and regressed repeatedly over millions of years, not once in a single flood. Coal deposits present their own testimony. Coal seams often contain upright fossil trees rooted in the coal. These trees grew in the swamp that became coal. Above the coal, sediment buried the swamp. New soil formed, new forests grew, new coal seams developed. Some locations show dozens of coal seams stacked vertically with fossil soils between them. Each seam represents a forest that grew for thousands of years, accumulated peat for thousands more, then got buried and compressed. The Cumberland coal field in the Appalachian region shows over 60 coal seams in vertical succession. A single flood cannot create this. The Karoo Basin in South Africa contains an estimated 800 billion vertebrate fossils. These animals represent a terrestrial ecosystem that lived over millions of years. The fossils show growth series from juvenile to adult, evidence of diseases, healed injuries, and predation marks. Many fossils are articulated skeletons in life positions, suggesting they were buried gradually, not catastrophically. Flood geologists cannot explain why 800 billion animals would all drown in one location. The Burgess Shale in British Columbia preserves soft-bodied Cambrian organisms in exquisite detail. Delicate features like gills, intestines, and eyes remain visible. These organisms were buried gently in fine mud that protected them from decay and scavenging. Catastrophic flood conditions would tear apart soft-bodied creatures and scatter their remains. The Burgess Shale shows a thriving marine ecosystem suddenly buried by a local mudslide, not a global catastrophe. Chalk formations like those forming the White Cliffs of Dover consist of coccolithophore shells. These microscopic algae have calcium carbonate plates that sink to the seafloor when the organisms die. The chalk is hundreds of feet thick and remarkably pure. Modern coccolithophore sedimentation occurs at rates measured in millimeters per thousand years. The chalk took millions of years to accumulate. Flood geologists must argue that coccolithophores bloomed massively during the flood, died, and settled in unmixed layers. This requires sedimentation rates millions of times faster than observed today, with perfect sorting that separates chalk from other sediments. Evaporite deposits form when seawater evaporates, leaving behind salt, gypsum, and other minerals. Some evaporite sequences are thousands of feet thick. The Mediterranean region contains massive evaporite deposits from the Messinian salinity crisis, when the Mediterranean Sea dried up about 5.5 million years ago. These deposits require repeated cycles of evaporation. Each cycle takes thousands of years. The total sequence represents millions of years. Evaporites cannot form underwater during a flood. They require exposure to air and sunlight. Varves are annual layers deposited in lakes. Each varve consists of a coarse light layer from spring and summer deposition and a fine dark layer from fall and winter settling. The Green River Formation in Wyoming, Colorado, and Utah contains millions of varves. Counting them directly yields ages of 6.5 million years for the formation. Each varve shows seasonal variations in fossil content, with abundant fossils in summer layers and fewer in winter layers. Some varves contain single fish fossils in perfect preservation, showing the fish died and settled gently to the lake bottom. Flood conditions would break apart fish and mix their bones with sediment. Coral reefs provide another testimony. Modern reefs grow at rates of about 1 to 10 millimeters per year. Ancient reef complexes can be hundreds of feet thick. The organisms are in growth position, showing they lived where they are found. Many show multiple generations growing on top of previous generations. Some ancient reefs show evidence of storm damage, regrowth, then additional storms. These cycles require time. A flood would rip coral colonies from their substrate and deposit them as rubble. Ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica show annual layers extending back 800,000 years in Antarctica and 123,000 years in Greenland. These layers contain trapped air bubbles preserving ancient atmosphere. The bubbles show carbon dioxide and methane levels varying with climate cycles. They record volcanic eruptions through ash layers. They show temperature variations through oxygen isotope ratios. The layers show no interruption 4,500 years ago. They show no evidence of the entire ice sheet melting and reforming rapidly after a flood. Tree ring chronologies extend over 12,000 years using overlapping sequences. The oldest living trees, bristlecone pines, exceed 4,800 years in age. These trees germinated before the flood date proposed by young Earth chronologies. The rings show annual growth patterns corresponding to regional climate. Wet years produce wide rings. Dry years produce narrow rings. The pattern matches between living trees, dead trees, and ancient timbers from archaeological sites. The chronology is continuous. No flood interrupts it. Radiometric dating provides absolute ages for rocks. Uranium decays to lead at a known rate. Potassium decays to argon. Rubidium decays to strontium. These decay rates are constant and measurable in laboratories. Different isotope systems give concordant ages for the same rocks, confirming the method's reliability. Rocks from the bottom of the Grand Canyon yield ages near 2 billion years. Rocks from the top yield ages near 270 million years. Volcanic rocks interbedded with sediments allow precise dating of the sedimentary sequence. Flood geologists argue that radiometric dating is unreliable. They claim decay rates varied during the flood or that initial conditions were different than assumed. These claims have been tested extensively. Decay rates do not change under any conditions achievable on Earth. Temperature, pressure, and chemical state do not affect decay rates. The only way to change decay rates significantly requires conditions inside stars. Different isotope systems giving concordant ages confirms that initial conditions are understood correctly. The RATE project, conducted by the Institute for Creation Research, attempted to find evidence for accelerated decay during the flood. After 8 years and significant funding, they found no such evidence. Their own data contradicted their hypothesis. They were forced to propose that God miraculously accelerated decay while simultaneously removing the heat that would have vaporized the planet. Once again, appeal to miracle became necessary when physics failed to cooperate. The geological evidence overwhelmingly supports an ancient Earth with gradual processes operating over vast timescales. Layers accumulated one by one. Environments changed repeatedly. Seas advanced and retreated. Mountains rose slowly. Erosion sculpted landscapes. Life evolved, diversified, and adapted to changing conditions. Mass extinctions occurred, followed by recovery and radiation of new forms. This story unfolds over 4.5 billion years, written in the rocks themselves. No global flood interrupts this narrative. The rocks show local floods, certainly. River deposits show flood layers interspedded with normal flow deposits. Lake beds show turbidites from underwater landslides. Coastal areas show tsunami deposits. These local catastrophes are real and recorded. They bear no resemblance to the global deluge described in Genesis. The search for flood evidence in the rocks leads to the same conclusion as the search for the water. It never happened, at least not globally. Perhaps we are asking the wrong question. Perhaps the flood was real, but regional. Reframing the flood, the Mesopotamian apocalypse. The Hebrew phrase kol eretz appears throughout Genesis. Translators render it as the whole earth or all the earth. This translation shapes how readers understand the flood narrative. The phrase can also mean the whole land or all the land, referring to a specific region rather than the entire planet. Context determines meaning. This linguistic flexibility opens a different way to understand the flood account. Ancient peoples understood geography differently than we do. For someone living in Mesopotamia around 3000 BCE, their world consisted of the lands they knew. Mesopotamia occupied the flat plain between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Mountains rose to the north and east, deserts stretched to the south and west. The known world was this region. Beyond lay unknown territories, but those were not truly part of their experienced reality. When Genesis says the flood covered all the high mountains under heaven, it may mean all the high mountains in their known world. When it says all flesh perished, it may mean all flesh in that region. This interpretation does not require dismissing the text. It requires understanding the text in its original context. Ancient authors wrote from their perspective. They described events as they would have experienced them. Mesopotamia's geography makes it uniquely vulnerable to catastrophic flooding. The land between the two rivers sits barely above sea level. Much of the region is flat with minimal topographic relief. The rivers flood regularly when snowmelt from the northern mountains exceeds their capacity. In ancient times, before modern flood control, these floods could be devastating. Water spreading across the flat plain would create a sea extending to every horizon. Archaeological evidence confirms that major floods struck Mesopotamian cities. Leonard Woolley excavated Ur in the 1920s and found a thick layer of water-deposited clay with no artifacts. Below this layer lay earlier occupation. Above it, later occupation resumed. Woolley initially claimed this represented the biblical flood. Later analysis showed the flood layer was local and dated to around 4000 BCE. Other cities showed different flood layers at different times. Mesopotamia experienced regular catastrophic floods throughout its history. Imagine experiencing a flood in this environment. You live in a city on the plain. Heavy rains begin. They continue for days. The rivers overflow, water spreads across the flat land, it rises higher than anyone has seen. The city floods, people retreat to the ziggurat or flee toward distant hills. The water continues rising. Eventually, looking in every direction, you see only water. The horizon shows water meeting sky. Your entire known world has drowned. Everyone you know either escaped with you or perished. This experience would certainly be recorded as the whole world flooding. The biblical account describes Noah's Ark coming to rest on the mountains of Ararat. These mountains lie in eastern Turkey, north of Mesopotamia. If a flood in Mesopotamia reached depths of 40 or 50 feet across the plain, an ark could certainly drift north and beach on the foothills of the mountains. The text need not mean the ark landed on Mount Ararat's 16,000-foot peak. The mountains of Ararat refers to the region, not the specific summit. The duration of the flood fits a regional catastrophe. Water covering the Mesopotamian plain could prevail for months before draining away. The flat topography and clay soils would prevent rapid drainage. Water would evaporate slowly, seep into the ground, and eventually flow toward the Persian Gulf. The timeline in Genesis becomes plausible for a regional event. The gathering of animals also makes more sense regionally. Noah need not collect every species from every continent. He gathers representative livestock and local wildlife to preserve them through the coming disaster. The list in Genesis includes domesticated animals and common wild species. These are precisely what a farmer would care about saving. The text does not mention kangaroos, penguins, or sloths because those animals lived far beyond the region and were unknown to the author. The cubit measurements given for the ark describe a large boat, roughly 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. This size can hold many animals and supplies. It need not accommodate every species on Earth. For a regional flood, the ark's capacity becomes sufficient. Building such a vessel would be challenging but possible with ancient techniques. Massive wooden ships were built in ancient times, though rarely this large. The theological purpose of the story remains intact with a regional interpretation. God judges the wickedness of humanity in that region. He warns Noah. He preserves a righteous remnant. He establishes a covenant afterward. The story teaches about sin, judgment, grace, and new beginnings. These themes do not depend on global geography. They work equally well in a regional context. Early Jewish interpretations sometimes understood the flood regionally. Philo of Alexandria, writing in the 1st century, suggested that the flood might not have covered the entire globe. Some rabbinic traditions held that certain lands were not flooded. The universal language became more rigid in later Christian interpretation, but the original audience may have understood the scope differently. The Table of Nations in Genesis 10 lists Noah's descendants spreading to various lands. The list includes peoples around Mesopotamia, the Mediterranean, and nearby regions. It does not mention peoples of East Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, Australia, or the Americas. This suggests the author's geographical awareness was regional. If the flood wiped out all humanity except Noah's family and his descendants repopulated the whole earth, we should expect the Table of Nations to include all known peoples. Instead, it includes only peoples of the ancient Near East. Genetic evidence shows that human populations around the world descend from populations that never went through a bottleneck of 8 individuals 14,500 years ago. Native American populations show genetic diversity consistent with migrations from Asia over 15,000 years ago. Aboriginal Australian populations show continuous habitation for over 50,000 years. African populations show the greatest genetic diversity, consistent with being the source population for all other humans. None of this evidence fits a recent global population bottleneck. All of it fits continuous regional populations with no universal catastrophe. A regional Mesopotamian flood can be catastrophic, world-ending for those who experienced it, while leaving other populations untouched. The survivors remember and record the event. The story spreads through oral tradition for generations. Eventually, it gets written down in the form we have in Genesis. The universal language reflects the universal nature of the experience for those who lived through it, not the geographical extent. This interpretation respects the text while accepting the physical evidence. It allows the flood story to be based on real events without requiring impossible hydrology or contradicting the geological record. The flood was real for those who experienced it. Their testimony, passed down through centuries, becomes our biblical narrative. The story's power comes from its human truth, not from global extent. Other ancient Near Eastern texts describe similar floods. The Epic of Gilgamesh, written before the Genesis account, tells of Utnapishtim, who built a boat to survive a flood sent by the gods. The story parallels Genesis closely, suggesting both draw from common Mesopotamian tradition about a historical flood. The Sumerian king list mentions a flood dividing pre-flood kings from post-flood kings. These references indicate that catastrophic flooding was part of the cultural memory of the region. The question becomes not, did the flood happen, but which flood? Mesopotamia experienced multiple catastrophic floods over millennia. One may have been particularly severe, forming the core memory that grew into the biblical narrative. The next section explores a specific candidate, an event that some scholars believe could have inspired flood legends across multiple cultures. The Black Sea Deluge, a scientific candidate for the core story. In 1997, marine geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman published a hypothesis that captured scientific and popular attention. They proposed that around 5600 BCE, the Black Sea experienced a catastrophic flood. This hypothesis remains highly contested, with more recent studies challenging key aspects of their interpretation. The basic idea suggests that rising sea levels from melting glaciers caused the Mediterranean Sea to breach the Bosporus Strait. Seawater would have poured into the Black Sea basin, raising its level and flooding areas around its shores. The Black Sea, before this proposed event, may have been a freshwater lake sitting below its current level. The surrounding shores would have been habitable, with settlements, farms, and villages. Ryan and Pittman calculated that if the Bosporus barrier suddenly failed, Mediterranean water would cascade into the basin like a waterfall, with flow about 200 times greater than Niagara Falls. Their model suggested the lake would rise rapidly, about 6 inches per day, with the shoreline advancing about a mile per day in the flattest areas. These dramatic figures remain disputed by subsequent research. For people living near the shores, this would be catastrophic. Imagine waking to find the sea has swallowed the land where you walked yesterday. Each day it advances further. Fields disappear. Villages flood. The water keeps rising. Eventually, people must abandon everything and flee inland. Communities that have lived by the lake for generations watch their entire world vanish beneath the waves. The hypothesis drew initial support from several lines of evidence, though many of these interpretations are now questioned. Core samples from the Black Sea floor show a transition from freshwater sediments to saltwater sediments around 7,600 years ago. Below this transition, the sediments contain freshwater mollusks. Above it, marine species appear. Ryan and Pittman interpreted this as evidence of sudden catastrophic flooding. Other researchers argue the transition occurred more gradually over centuries or even millennia. Robert Ballard, the oceanographer who found the Titanic, conducted underwater surveys of the Black Sea. His team discovered an ancient shoreline submerged about 500 feet below the current surface. This shoreline shows features like beach deposits and wave-cut terraces. It represents a lower lake level from the past. Ballard's team reported finding what appeared to be wooden structures and stone tools on the submerged shelf. However, a comprehensive 2022 literature review concluded there is insufficient underwater archaeological evidence to support any catastrophic submergence of prehistoric Black Sea settlements. The finds remain ambiguous and have not been definitively confirmed as human structures from before a rapid flood. The hypothesis faces substantial criticism from multiple directions. Many geologists now argue that the transition from freshwater to saltwater occurred gradually rather than catastrophically. Core data may show apparent abruptness because sedimentation rates vary naturally, creating sharp boundaries that do not necessarily indicate rapid events. The flooding may have taken decades, centuries, or even longer, rather than the dramatic months proposed initially. Carbon dating of mollusk shells shows some inconsistency. Different shells from similar depths yield different ages. This complicates efforts to establish a precise timeline. Some researchers argue the Black Sea flood occurred earlier than 5,600 BCE, perhaps around 8,000 BCE. Others suggest multiple flooding events happened at different times. Despite ongoing debate about the specifics, most geologists accept that the Black Sea did transition from a freshwater or brackish lake to a marine sea at some point when rising post-glacial sea levels eventually connected it to the Mediterranean. The key question remains whether this happened catastrophically over months or gradually over centuries to millennia. Current evidence increasingly favors the gradual scenario, though research continues. Could such an event, whether rapid or gradual, have inspired flood narratives of the ancient Near East? The possibility exists, but significant challenges complicate any direct connection. The timeline presents the first problem. The proposed transition around 5600 BCE precedes the earliest written accounts by thousands of years. Stories would need to pass through oral tradition for over 3,000 years before appearing in Sumerian texts, then later in Genesis. While oral traditions can persist that long, details typically change dramatically over such timescales, making it difficult to trace specific events. Geographic considerations also matter. Mesopotamia lies hundreds of miles from the Black Sea. Populations affected by a Black Sea flood would need to migrate south, carrying their flood story with them. Some archaeologists propose that refugees from the Black Sea flood migrated into Mesopotamia and Anatolia, spreading agriculture and bringing their cultural memories. This migration hypothesis remains speculative but plausible. The Black Sea hypothesis offers one scientifically documented possibility for how geological events might contribute to flood mythology. If a significant transition occurred, whether rapid or gradual, it could have affected populations and created cultural memory. That memory might evolve through retelling. Different groups could adapt it to their own contexts. Eventually, it might contribute to written narratives like Genesis, though proving such connections remains speculative. This does not mean Genesis simply records the Black Sea flood. The relationship between historical event and biblical narrative is far more complex. Generations of oral tradition, theological reflection, and literary crafting separate the two. The Genesis author wrote to convey theological meaning, not to preserve historical details. The story serves purposes far beyond documenting hydrology. Other catastrophic floods could also contribute to the tradition. Local flooding in Mesopotamia, as discussed previously, provides a more geographically direct source. The Black Sea flood adds another possible layer. Both events could have influenced the tradition separately or together. Flood memories from different times and places might have merged into a single narrative. The hypothesis reminds us that catastrophic floods are real. They happened. They devastated communities. The survivors remembered. Their descendants told the stories. These stories became part of cultural identity. Over time, they took on mythological proportions, serving to explain human origins, divine judgment, and moral order. The historical kernel may be small, but the cultural fruit grows large. Whether or not the Black Sea transition directly inspired the Genesis account remains uncertain and contested. The hypothesis demonstrates an important principle. Real geological events can contribute to mythological narratives, even if the connections are indirect and complex. The myth carries meaning that transcends factual detail. It speaks to human experience, fear, hope, and relationship with the divine. The search for the Genesis flood in a specific historical event may be misguided. The power of the story does not depend on locating the exact flood that inspired it. Multiple floods likely contributed. The story evolved over centuries, incorporating experiences and theological insights from many sources. What matters is not which specific flood, but that floods happened, people suffered, survivors remembered, and meaning emerged from the experience. Catastrophic floods shape human consciousness. They remind us of nature's power. They test our ability to survive. They force us to flee or fight. In their aftermath, we rebuild and remember. These experiences become stories. The stories become myths. The myths teach us who we are. A tapestry of tales, global flood myths from local disasters. Flood stories appear across human cultures worldwide. Mesopotamian civilizations told of Utnapishtim. The Greeks spoke of Deucalion. Hindu texts describe Manu. Chinese tradition recounts Gun and Yu taming the floods. Indigenous American peoples have numerous flood narratives. The widespread nature of these stories has led some to argue they preserve memory of a single global event. The evidence suggests otherwise. The Epic of Gilgamesh, written in ancient Mesopotamia around 2100 BCE, contains the earliest known version of a flood myth. In this story, the gods decide to destroy humanity with a flood. Ea warns Utnapishtim to build a boat. He brings his family, craftsmen, and animals aboard. The storm lasts 6 days and 7 nights. The boat runs aground on a mountain. Utnapishtim sends out birds to test whether waters have receded. He offers sacrifice when he emerges. The gods smell the offering and gather around. The parallels to Genesis are obvious. Both stories feature divine judgment, a warned hero, a boat, animals landing on a mountain, birds sent out, and sacrifice afterward. The similarities suggest literary dependence or common source material. Most scholars believe the Genesis account adapted earlier Mesopotamian traditions. This makes sense given that the biblical patriarchs originated in Mesopotamia according to the narrative itself. Greek mythology tells of Deucalion and Pyrrha. Zeus grows angry at human wickedness and sends a flood to destroy humanity. Prometheus warns his son Deucalion to build an ark. Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha survive 9 days of flooding. They land on Mount Parnassus. They repopulate the earth by throwing stones that become people. This story differs in details, but shares the core structure of divine judgment, flood, survival pair, and repopulation. Hindu tradition describes Manu, the first human. Vishnu appears as a fish and warns Manu of a coming flood. Manu builds a boat. He brings the 7 sages and samples of all species. The flood covers the earth. Manu's boat is tied to the fish's horn. The fish guides them to a mountain. When waters recede, Manu repopulates the earth. Again, the same basic pattern appears with local cultural adaptations. Chinese mythology approaches flooding differently. Rather than divine judgment, the floods result from natural chaos. Gun attempts to control the floods by building barriers. He fails and is punished. His son Yu succeeds by dredging channels to guide the water away. Yu becomes a great hero and emperor. This narrative focuses on human ingenuity, overcoming natural disaster rather than divine punishment and redemption. Indigenous peoples across North America have flood traditions. The Haida of the Pacific Northwest tell of a great flood that covered the land. People survived by tying their canoes to mountain peaks. The Hopi describe emerging from previous worlds that were destroyed by floods. The Cherokee speak of a great flood sent as punishment. The Anishinaabe tell of Nanabosho surviving a flood on a log with animals who help recreate the earth. The Inca civilization in South America had flood myths. The creator god Viracocha destroyed a previous race of giants with a flood, then created humans again. The Mapuche people tell of a battle between serpents causing water to rise and destroy the world. The Yanomami of the Amazon describe a flood that forced people to retreat to mountaintops. Australian Aboriginal traditions include flood stories. The Kurnai people describe the sea rising to cover the land. The Gunditj Mara tell of volcanic eruptions causing the land to flood. The Yolngu speak of ancestral beings causing floods during the Dreamtime. This global distribution suggests that floods are a universal human experience. Every region experiences flooding. Rivers overflow, tsunamis strike coasts, storms bring torrential rains. In a pre-industrial world without modern flood control, these events were far more devastating. A major flood could destroy entire communities. Survivors would naturally remember and recount the event. These local catastrophes become culturally significant. They mark time. Events are dated to before or after the flood. They explain landscape features. That lake exists because of the Great Flood. They teach moral lessons. The flood came because of human wickedness or divine displeasure. They establish cultural identity. We are descended from the flood survivors. Over generations, these stories evolve. Details change with each retelling. The flood grows larger in memory. What destroyed a valley becomes a regional catastrophe. What was regional becomes world-ending. Hyperbole serves narrative purpose. The bigger the disaster, the more impressive the survival. The more impressive the survival, the more significant the ancestors. Different flood myths share similar structures, not because they remember the same event, but because they respond to similar experiences with similar narrative patterns. Humans process trauma through story. We create meaning from disaster. The flood myth provides a template. Divine or natural forces bring destruction. A hero or small group survives. Life begins again. Order emerges from chaos. The psychological appeal of flood myths runs deep. They validate our fear of water's power. They affirm our ability to survive. They explain suffering as meaningful rather than random. They promise renewal after catastrophe. These themes resonate across cultures because they address universal human concerns. Geological evidence confirms that different regions experience different floods at different times. The Mediterranean basin has a complex history of sea level changes. The Red Sea experienced rapid inundation as Ice Age glaciers melted. The Persian Gulf was dry land during the last Ice Age, then flooded rapidly when sea levels rose. Coastal areas worldwide were inundated as glacial melt raised oceans roughly 400 feet over several thousand years. These post-glacial floods would have been catastrophic for coastal populations. Imagine living on what is now the continental shelf. Sea level rises gradually over generations. Eventually, the rate accelerates. The land where your grandparents lived now lies underwater. Your village must relocate again and again. This multi-generational trauma becomes part of cultural memory. Stories preserve and process the experience. Some researchers propose that certain flood myths preserve specific geological events. The Black Sea deluge might explain Near Eastern and Eastern European flood traditions. The flooding of the Persian Gulf as seas rose could contribute to Mesopotamian myths. The inundation of Doggerland connecting Britain to continental Europe might underlie European flood stories. Each region has its own candidate events. The problem with this approach is that it remains speculative. Connecting a specific geological event to a specific myth requires strong chronological and geographical evidence. Such evidence rarely exists. Oral traditions change too much over thousands of years to preserve reliable details. Archaeological evidence for prehistoric coastal populations is limited because their sites are now underwater. More importantly, insisting on a single historical event for each flood myth misses the point. Flood myths are not failed history. They are successful mythology. Their purpose is not to document hydrology, but to make meaning. They explain origins, teach morals, establish identity, and process trauma. Whether they remember a specific flood matters less than what they do for the culture that tells them. The Genesis flood narrative participates in this wider human tradition. It shares structures and motifs with other flood myths because it draws from common Mesopotamian sources and responds to common human experiences. Its uniqueness lies not in describing a flood, but in its theological message. The God of Israel judges wickedness, shows grace to the righteous, and establishes covenant with creation. These theological claims distinguish Genesis from Gilgamesh, even though both tell of flooding. Understanding flood myths as cultural responses to real but local disasters resolves the tension between the stories and the evidence. We need not choose between dismissing the myths as fiction or defending them as global history. The myths are true in the sense that they truthfully represent human experience and meaning making. They are not true in the sense of documenting a single worldwide catastrophe. The variety of flood myths enriches rather than undermines their significance. Each culture processed disaster through its own lens. Each created narratives that served its own needs. Together, they testify to the universal human capacity for storytelling, survival, and creating meaning from chaos. The question is not whether the flood happened, but what the story means. Beyond the literal, the enduring power of the parable. The search for the floodwaters leads to a paradox. The more carefully we examine the physical evidence, the less plausible a global flood becomes. The waters never existed. The mechanisms proposed to create or remove them violate physics. The geological record shows no evidence for such an event. Yet the story endures, powerful and meaningful across thousands of years and countless cultures. This paradox resolves when we recognize that truth takes multiple forms. Scientific truth describes physical reality through observation and measurement. Historical truth documents what happened through evidence and testimony. Literary truth conveys meaning through narrative and symbol. Theological truth addresses our relationship with the divine, with meaning, with ultimate questions. These truths are not competitors. They operate in different domains. Genesis belongs primarily to theological and literary truth. It was composed to teach about God, humanity, sin, judgment, grace, and covenant. These are the story's central concerns. The author used familiar narrative forms, drew from existing flood traditions, and crafted a story that would communicate theological truths to its audience. The story's power comes from these truths, not from its hydrology. The opening chapters of Genesis establish patterns. God creates order from chaos. God separates waters above from waters below, creating habitable space. Humans are made in God's image, given purpose and responsibility. They choose disobedience. Sin enters creation. Violence spreads. God responds with judgment and grace intertwined. The flood represents the uncreation. Waters above and waters below collapse together. The separation dissolves. Chaos returns, yet a remnant survives in the ark, a small space of order within the chaos, floating on the waters like the spirit in creation hovered over the deep. When the flood ends, the pattern repeats. God recreates. The waters separate again. Dry land appears. Life emerges from the ark. Humans again receive blessing and commission. The covenant with Noah echoes the creation blessing. Be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth. A new beginning comes after judgment. This theological structure matters far more than whether water covered Everest. The covenant itself carries profound significance. God promises never again to destroy the earth with flood. The rainbow serves as a reminder, not just to humans, but to God. When God sees the bow in the clouds, God remembers the covenant. This anthropomorphic language shows God's self-limiting, choosing to maintain relationship despite human wickedness. The story teaches that judgment has limits, that grace ultimately prevails, that creation will continue. The flood narrative addresses the problem of evil. Why does wickedness persist? Why does God not destroy the wicked? The story provides an answer. God tried that. It did not work. After the flood, humanity proves just as wicked as before. Noah's first act after leaving the ark is to plant a vineyard, get drunk, and create a family conflict. The flood changed nothing about human nature. Therefore, God chooses a different approach. Rather than destruction, God works through covenant relationship. Rather than eliminating evil, God commits to redeeming creation from within. This theological move shapes all that follows in Scripture. God calls Abraham, works through people, establishes covenant with communities, sends prophets, and ultimately becomes incarnate in Christian tradition. The flood story sets this trajectory. Destruction fails. Relationship becomes the path forward. The story also addresses human mortality and limitation. Before the flood, people lived for centuries according to the genealogies. After the flood, lifespans decrease dramatically. God declares that human days shall be 120 years. This change marks the transition from mythic time to something approaching historical time. The pre flood world exists in a different register where the normal rules do not fully apply. The post flood world becomes more recognizable, more like the world the audience inhabits. Literary analysis reveals sophisticated narrative technique. The story uses chiastic structure, a form where elements repeat in reverse order. The first half ascends to the peak of the flood. The second half descends symmetrically as waters recede. God remembers Noah at the exact center of the narrative. This literary artistry shows intentional composition, not a simple recording of historical events. The author crafted the story carefully to convey meaning through form and content together. The animals entering the ark by twos or by sevens for clean animals creates a procession image. All creation comes to the ark for salvation. Noah becomes a second Adam, preserving life through catastrophe. The ark itself functions as a temple symbol in some readings. It has three levels, like the tabernacle has three zones. It contains life, like the Holy of Holies contains the presence of God. It floats on chaos waters, maintaining order within disorder. These symbolic layers enrich the story beyond simple narrative. The raven and dove sent from the ark carry symbolic weight. The raven, an unclean bird, goes back and forth but does not return with news. The dove, a clean bird, returns with an olive branch, symbol of peace and new life. These details work narratively and symbolically. They advance the plot while conveying meaning about clean and unclean, about hope and renewal, about signs of God's grace. Reading the flood story as parable or theological narrative does not diminish it. Parables are not lies, they are truth told through story. Jesus taught primarily in parables. His parables about sowers, seeds, lost coins, prodigal sons, and good Samaritans conveyed profound truths about the kingdom of God. No one asks whether the prodigal son was a real person from a specific town. The question misunderstands the genre. The truth of the parable lies in its meaning, not its historicity. The same applies to Genesis. The story's truth lies in what it teaches about God, humanity, sin, judgment, grace, and covenant. These truths remain whether or not water covered the mountains. In fact, insisting on literal historicity can obscure the deeper meanings. When we argue about cubits and cubic miles, we miss the theological richness. Many religious traditions have embraced this understanding. Jewish interpretation has long recognized multiple levels of meaning in Scripture: the literal sense, the allegorical sense, the moral sense, and the mystical sense all contribute to understanding. Christian interpreters from Origen and Augustine through medieval scholastics to modern theologians have employed similar approaches. The Reformers emphasized literal interpretation, but understood that literal meant the author's intended meaning, which could include metaphor, poetry, and symbol. Contemporary biblical scholarship across denominational lines increasingly reads Genesis 1 to 11 as primeval history, a genre distinct from the historical narratives beginning with Abraham. Primeval history uses mythological forms to address theological questions about origins, human nature, and divine purpose. It sets the stage for the historical narrative but operates differently. Recognizing this genre allows interpreting the text on its own terms rather than imposing modern categories. This approach respects the text more than literalism does. It asks what the author intended to communicate and how the original audience would have understood it. It recognizes that ancient Near Eastern peoples thought differently about history, myth, and truth than modern Western cultures do. It allows the text to speak from its own context rather than forcing it into ours. The flood story addresses existential questions every culture faces. Why do bad things happen? Why does God allow wickedness? How do we make sense of catastrophe? What hope exists after disaster? How do we start again? These questions have no simple answers. The flood narrative does not provide answers in the form of explanations. It provides them in the form of story, which can hold complexity and mystery that explanations cannot. The story also serves communal functions. It establishes identity. We are descendants of Noah. We are the people of the covenant. We remember the flood and know that God keeps promises. The rainbow reminds us. Our rituals reenact these truths. Our scriptures preserve them. Identity forms through shared narrative more than through shared facts. The moral dimension of the story remains relevant. Wickedness brings consequences. The earth filled with violence, and violence brought destruction. This is not primarily about divine punishment, but about cause and effect. Violence creates conditions that lead to breakdown. This truth operates in our world constantly. Systems of injustice eventually collapse. Societies built on exploitation face reckoning. The flood story warns that we cannot sustain wickedness indefinitely, yet grace accompanies judgment. God warns Noah. God provides means of salvation. God preserves life. God establishes covenant. Even in the midst of deserved judgment, grace operates. This tension between justice and mercy runs throughout Scripture. The flood story holds them together. Judgment comes and grace comes. Both are real. Neither cancels the other. The promise that the flood will not recur matters deeply in an era of climate change. We face rising waters again, though from different causes. Coastal cities confront inundation. Island nations may disappear. We create our own catastrophe through carbon emissions and environmental degradation. The covenant promise means not that we are safe from floods, but that God remains committed to creation. The rainbow reminds us that the earth endures, that seasons continue, that life persists. This promise calls us to partnership. God will not destroy the earth, so we must not either. The story warns against hubris. Humans are not God. We cannot control creation absolutely. We are part of the creation, subject to its dynamics. The flood demonstrates that human wickedness has consequences beyond our control. We can trigger catastrophes we cannot stop. This humility matters as we develop technologies with planetary impact. The story reminds us that we are stewards, not owners. We are participants, not masters. Hope emerges as the story's ultimate gift. After catastrophe, life begins again. After judgment, covenant forms. After the waters, the dove returns with green in its beak. The story says that endings are not final, that new beginnings follow disaster, that grace creates possibility, even from destruction. This hope has sustained communities through countless catastrophes across millennia. The search for the floodwaters began with a simple question about hydrology. It ends with deeper questions about meaning, truth, and what stories do for us. The waters never existed as described, but the story remains true in more important ways. It tells us who we are. It warns us about wickedness. It shows us grace. It establishes covenant. It gives us hope. Perhaps the question was wrong from the start. Where did the waters go? They went into the story, into meaning, into the human heart where stories live and do their work. They flow still, not across mountaintops, but through consciousness, carrying truths that facts alone cannot convey. The flood is not behind us in history. It surrounds us in meaning. We swim in it still, seeking the ark, watching for the dove, waiting for dry land, hoping for the rainbow that promises the storm will pass and life will continue. The story endures because it speaks to what endures in us: fear of chaos, hope for order, consciousness of wrongdoing, yearning for grace, awareness of mortality, hunger for meaning. These are not ancient concerns, they are human concerns. The flood story addresses them as powerfully today as it did 3,000 years ago, not because it reports hydrology accurately, but because it reports the human condition truthfully. In the end, the search for the waters reveals what matters most about the story. Not its physics, but its wisdom. Not its geology, but its theology. Not whether it happened, but what it means. The waters have gone where waters and stories always go, into the deep places of human imagination and spirit, where they continue to rise and fall, to threaten and to cleanse, to destroy and to renew, forever reminding us that endings make way for beginnings, that judgment travels with grace, and that even when the whole world drowns, life finds a way to float, to land, to begin again.